economic authority in the world today, it will tell you Africa is the continent of the future. Why? Most of the growing economies in the world today are found on the continent, instilling confidence across investors from a chessboard of sectors in the economic fields. But that economic optimism and joy is wrapped in tears of poverty and plundered by corruption, poor governance, and illicit trade. With a unique mission to promote and prioritize Africa's economic agenda, how should the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa anchor its policies today? My guest today on Globe Watch is UN Undersecretary and the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Carlos Lopes, welcome to Globe Watch.
Thank you.
Will you agree to the fact that making the African economic outlook look like the transatlantic market corridor is the hardest mission ever to be entrusted to anyone on earth?
Well, you know, Africa really has a lot of good news in terms of economic growth. And in fact, this growth is accelerating slowly. But when you compare to other regions in the world, it's actually very encouraging to see that Africa is now at the top. Only a few countries in Asia are growing faster than Africa. And I think that is not a region as such. As a region, we are the fastest growing. And why is that? A number of factors. A lot of people think it's a commodity boom. Because of our commodities being in high demand by emerging markets, we have a bonus. That is partly true. Second, very common story is to say that China and other investors have put their eyes into Africa and therefore are creating an additional boost in terms of Africa's economic productivity and also economic output. That is also true. But what people normally don't know is that Africa really has growth that is balanced between oil-producing countries, non-oil producing countries, between countries that are large, between countries that are small. So it's quite widespread.
You said that it is quite widespread. So you totally discard and reject the option that Africa's economic optimism is not a blank check in a failing bank?
No, it is not. And in fact, when we look into the composition of this growth, 2/3 are coming from internal consumption, which basically means that it's the middle class that is growing. We have a middle class now that is as large as India, for more or less the same demographic size. But when we look into our average GDP per capita, our basically measure of how rich people are, we are richer than the average Indian. So which basically means that, yes, Africa does have not only widespread growth, but it's growth that is coming from within more than from the outside. So it is really time for us to believe this is more sustained than normally it appears. Even when there is a crisis in other regions of the world, developing economies are doing better than developed economies, but in general, all are with sluggish growth. But we are quite ahead, and I think because of our low base, we have a long way to go.
We have a long way to go, surely, because there are so many challenges facing the African economic market. And according to the latest African Progress Panel report chaired by former United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan, the continent loses some $38 billion yearly to tax avoidance, secret mine deals, and illegal money flows. Africa loses twice as much money through these loopholes as it gets from donors. Those are the words of Kofi Annan. How can you torpedo this trade in Africa?
Well, you know, we put too much emphasis on aid, and it is true that aid is not just dwindling slightly, but we have a phenomena where remittances, for instance, from African diaspora are more than development aid. We have also a situation where the reserves that Africa has can generate returns that are bigger than aid. And if you add to this the criminal activities that are around our natural resources and illicit financial flows, going all the way from mispricing to problems of taxation to issues relating to economic causes of conflict, it is clear that Africa does possess the resources for its own development. So it is a matter of governance, as you have put it at the beginning. It is a matter of governance for us to be able to use these resources more adequately for our own development.
Throughout your stay in Cameroon for more than 72 hours, you have constantly used the expression or the word transformation. We need to transform the African economy. This is a word which is recurrent in nearly all Africa Economic Report compiled by your organization. What are you meaning when you say transformation? What do we need to transform, and why should we transform the African economy?
Because, you know, we have been under development for the last 50 years. And take an example from agriculture, where I just produced the numbers. You know, we have 20 years of investment in agriculture from development aid.
How much cash was injected?
About $15 billion were injected in the African agriculture. The productivity remained stuck in 1.5 tons per hectare during the 20 years. So all that investment didn't change one comma in terms of the productivity of African agriculture. Why? Because we have been treating it as if it was just a poverty reduction program, as just a food security issue, when in fact it's an economic activity. You know, in any other part of the world, if you treat agriculture as an economic activity, you are going to create the policy incentives that are going to allow for productivity to be gained. That is what transformation is about. But for us, the most important anchor of transformation is really the change of the composition of our economies. And for that, we need to put a lot of emphasis on industry. Why? Because if you look into the demographics of Africa, the population growth and the urbanization, and the fact that most of our population is going to be young, better educated, more connected, and of course more urbanized than their predecessors. What do you expect these people to want? And why do you see all this restless attitude on the part of the youth? They want modern jobs. And these modern jobs are not going to be possible to create without industrialization. That's what other regions of the world did, and that's what we have to do as well.
You are talking about young people. Before coming to Cameroon, you were in India, specifically on the 7th of February to attend a conference on sustainable development. Let me quote your words. By 2050, Africa's youth alone will constitute over a quarter of the world's labor force. With a rising middle class and rapid urbanization taking place at a rate that is more than twice the world's urban growth rate of 3.7% a year, unavoidably, demand for food, energy, and water will rise. Now, how do you balance the scale in transforming the African youths, who are going to lead the economy in terms of capacity building, human resource refashioning? How are you going to manage all of that with resources which are becoming scarce? There are so many other related themes beside that: energy, water, food.
Well, first of all, by managing. That's the word. Because it is true, let's take food. We have 60% of the non-used arable land of the world. So we have to contribute to feed the world. This is not happening right now, but it will be the way of the future. If we take into account the fact that our productivity is so low, just look at the productivity of agriculture in Brazil or in China, and immediately you'll see, you know, the vast territory that we'll still have to cover in order for us to actually produce and manage things better. Then take water. Water, we have reservoirs that are quite substantial. In fact, even aquifers that were not known before in desert areas will make clear that Africa has a potential for a better water management than we ever thought just 20 years ago. Take energy. We have the best renewable energy resources in the world. It is proven that Africa can not only put electricity across the continent, but also create the basis for its industrial revolution just with renewable energy. We don't even need to touch oil or gas or any of the fossil fuel generated energy. Take all these examples and basically the answer is the same. Africa has the potential, but Africa has to manage. If we don't manage, others will just come and take it, as it has been done for the last 50 years, as it will be done for the remaining years ahead, if we really don't manage it. Now, our youth, that is going to be the labor force of the world, because it is going to be the highest concentration of labor capacity in the world, is not going to forgive us if we don't take today the measures that will put Africa in the right path. That's why we are all engaged in this construction of a vision for Africa in 50 years called the Africa Agenda 2063.
Absolutely. And how do you realize all of that, Mr. Executive Secretary, when one issue which is expected to determine this is compromised? I'm talking about finances. I'm talking about cash money. Let me just give you some statistics. Illicit financial flow, Renewable Africa magazine was told last year by a Nigerian diplomat that illicit financial flow cost Africa $800 billion between 1970 to 2008. That is, if you do an accurate mathematical calculation, it's about $50 billion a year. How do you assure the job seekers, like I saw last year's economic report for Africa compiled by an organization again was saying, how do you instill confidence in them when the leadership mantle is like a financial scandal?
Well, I mean, it is a number of factors. This illicit financial flows issue is very much at the top of the agenda of the African heads of state. They have created a commission to deal with it, chaired by President Becky. I'm the vice chair of that commission. And we are compiling a report that will be tabled to the heads of state in June this year in the summit that is going to take place in Malabo. So this is not something that is...
But it sounds sad because those who are responsible for illicit financial flow are those in the corridors of power. So how do you coach them?
True, but partly is corruption, but partly is also just lack of knowledge. Like for instance, mispricing is very widespread. Mispricing is a practice where multinationals basically pay for your product much less than its value in the world market. And it's just lack of knowledge. Another very common practice is that we don't have in place in African countries the engineering capability to know exactly what is extracted. So people declare how much they have extracted, but we don't have anybody in the regulatory systems of the state that is capable of checking whether that is accurate or not. Okay. You know, maybe what is being exported is twice what is declared. Okay. So you have these issues of corruption, but you have also issues of just competence. Okay. And Africans have not been able to manage their natural resources in a proper way. And more important than that, and this is why we are putting emphasis again on industrialization, is that we need to take those natural resources and transform them. Okay. We have to process them and not export them raw.
Okay, 3 questions before we end. The first one has to do with sustaining the growth and for it to have impact on the population. It is true, everybody says Africa's economic growth rate is about 6.6% and it's going to increase. You have countries like Cote d'Ivoire, which are just coming from a terrible civil war. It's about 8 to 9%. Angola is picking up well. Equatorial Guinea, even Ethiopia, they are picking up well. Why is it that these countries which are coming from a terrible situation are doing well and their salary scale is better, and then countries where you have had sustained peace and stability over 50 years are performing so poor? And how would that growth impact the population? Because that is the target mission.
Well, you know, if we take the macro view, it is true that Africa still have a lot of people that are under the poverty line. It's about 40-something% in the continent, but what you have to know is that according to all measurements, it is diminishing. And it is diminishing despite the fact that we have quite a significant demographic growth. Now, of course, people don't see, if you are poor in a particular country and you don't see your fortunes turn around, you'll say, I don't see this growth is not touching me. it's not coming my way. And it's probably true.
Because that is the situation in South Africa. They will tell you that it's Africa's economic giant. But when you go to South Africa, you have 70% of the young people out of the job market. You go to a city like Johannesburg.
It's not 70.
The hotels are good, but when you go to the peripheries, it is a scandal.
Yeah.
So how do you manage all of that? You
True.
go to Lagos, Nigeria is the same. Yaoundé, Cameroon, the same.
No, but you see, because people are impatient. But if you and it's very understandable. No, it's very understandable. But take the housing situation in South Africa. Since the end of apartheid, 5 million houses have been built by the government and given to the poorest part of the population. 5 million. But they have a deficit of 30 million. You see, so it's not possible to turn around the fortunes as quickly as people want.
Okay.
But I think it is clear that the path in Africa is one of growth. The path in Africa is also one of inequality. And normally both go together. It's unfortunate, but you don't know of any part of the world that has grown without inequality also growing. You can diminish. You can actually make sure that through regulatory systems, through policies, through interventions, you are going to diminish this inequality trend. For instance, in the Scandinavian countries is a classic example where they've been able to keep this under a certain level of control. But don't forget that the third richest person in the world is from Scandinavia. So you always have the two sides of the story, and normally people only want to look into the impatient side of the story, which is understandable because that gives us a sense of urgency, and it is the sense of urgency that will allow us transformation.
One but last question. Since 1958, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa has been contributing in several ways to take the country out of economic dilemma. Tell me, agencies are associated with your work. What is the work of the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the African Development Bank, and ECA? Where are you people different in taking Africa forward?
Well, there are differences. If there were no differences, this world would be really quite dull, if everybody was saying the same thing. It is normal that we have differences. Actually, the mandates are also quite different. Let's take the example of the IMF. The IMF is an institution that is really focused on macroeconomic stability. So they will come into a country and their number one preoccupation.
When you talk about macroeconomic stability, I want my old mother in the village who have not gone to school to understand what you are talking, because that is the target.
No, I agree, but I'm not here to defend the IMF. I'm just saying what they do.
No, just the concept. That's
yes,
my area of interest.
Yes, but that's their mandate. That's what they do. They go into the, let's say, like an accountant. They go into a country and they look into the stability, so they can very much identify the elements that will make this framework not sustainable, and they will advise governments consequently, and they would like to go in the direction of making sure that the markets are going to respond to the incentives that macroeconomic environment produces. Therefore, they are pushing in that direction. Take the example of the African Development Bank. They will say our number one priority is to rally investment for the continent. And in order for us to have more investment for the continent, more capital coming for the various projects of the continent, we need to identify the priorities in terms of what the transformation agenda may be. And in their case, they say most of our money is going for infrastructure. But take ECA. ECA is a think tank. We are really in the realm of policy. And what we want is to produce ideas and to produce recommendations for the debate, so countries have really the opportunity of looking into their agenda of development and enhance it. Sometimes our advice is taken, sometimes is not.
Most people will accuse you of policy. Can you concretely tell me what you guys have achieved before we end this interview, so that the ordinary man understands what ACAS has actually done for Africa?
Well, I will give you just one example. When everybody was very busy with structural adjustment, ECA was saying structural adjustment is no good. We have this alternative framework for structural adjustment. It was not listened to. 20 years later, everybody is doing what ECA has proposed at that time. So this is exactly what policy when it is well done, when it is properly done, can achieve is to shift the debate so it has an influence and an impact in the way we invest our resources and in the way the different countries look at development from a different perspective.
Final thought. In 1987, Mr. Strong, the Canadian delegation to the UN World Commission on the Environment and Development, remarked, and I quote, "Virtually all the major forces which determine our well-being and shape our lives today must be perceived and addressed in a global perspective. In a world full of inequalities, economic, political, social, is it possible to consider that statement today?"
Mr. Maurice Strong now lives in China, so it is very interesting that he is not living in Canada, he is living in China. So it means that from a global perspective, he understood where some of the drivers are. So we have just to follow his example.
Everybody.
Everybody.
The Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa and UN Undersecretary General, Bissau Guinean Carlos Lopes, thanks very much for accepting to be guest on our program today.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you, Charles.
You're welcome. The International Labour Organization states that globally 75 million youths are out of the job market, aged between 15 to 25. Thousands of children are sexually assaulted by the Catholic establishment. That is according to the United Nations again. And you have millions of others suffering across the world. When you hear such blistering figures, are you saddened, traumatized, or sickened?
I'm all those things, but I'm also so hopeful and so optimistic. And let me tell you why. For each of those figures, which are true, and they cause us great sorrow, there are figures that tell a story of achievement, of success, and of hope. Across this great continent of Africa, for example, maternal mortality is reducing. The number of women who die from preventable causes when giving birth, that's going down.
27% reduction.
It's extraordinary.
The Secretary General equally calls on your team. I'm reading the last two lines of the last paragraph of his letter to you, to work in total independence, impartiality, and objectivity with the sole objective of contributing to the promotion and protection of human rights. You are going to a country where petrol is the principal source of the situation where we are today. If they give you petrol, will you turn blind to justice?
I'm not a petrol merchant, so if they give me petrol, I'll go and keep it where. Do I have tanks? So first of all, let us see the practicality. Secondly, I think that for those who know me, and that one of the criteria for choosing somebody like me is that they know about my integrity. They know that wherever I have worked, either nationally, internationally, integrity, independence, and honesty has been my watchwords. And that's why they chose those who are there. They might there, but we must know that there are other people, even in Cameroon, even in Africa, even in the world, who also possess these qualities of integrity. But I thank God that the finger came on my head. If I was dead, they would choose another person. The job will not be stifled. Even if I fall dead today, it will go ahead. So there are sons and daughters of Africa. There are sons and daughters of Cameroon who can proudly claim that they will be independent, that they are people of integrity, that they are honest people. I think that these qualities were recognized in us who were chosen, and I pray the Almighty God that I will live up to what is expected of me.
This is an exclusive interview you are granting to CRTV ever since you are appointed by the United Nations Secretary General to head one of this important mission, which is expected to contribute in the rebuilding of peace and stability in the Central African Republic. And Ban Ki-moon concludes its letter by saying that, I look forward to hearing from you regarding this important assignment. Yours sincerely, Ban Ki-moon, UN Secretary General. When will you be heading to New York to meet him and to discuss this issue and trash it out?
In the next few weeks. You see, what is holding us, there will have to be logistics.